Good morning, Clancy. Thanks a lot for finding the time to have this conversation with me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Clancy Martin is a Canadian philosopher, professor, and writer. And today we are talking about his last essay, How Not to Kill Yourself, published in Spain this year by Gato Pardo, with the title Cómo, acabar, todo. In this book, Clancy, you carry out a thorough analysis of the suicidal mind and its multiple facets. Why was it important for you to write this book?
Thank you so much for asking, and again for having me. Well, what happened was some years ago, I had been asked by a magazine here in the States to write a piece of nonfiction, and I wasn't sure what to write about. So I told the editor that I could write about my time in mental hospitals. And as I was working on this essay, my editor had someone very, very close to him to make a suicide attempt. And he said, so perhaps you could focus on this issue of suicide. And I said, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that. When that essay came out, it turned out to be extremely widely read. And all of a sudden, people started emailing me from all over the world, from Spain, from London, from Germany, from China, from Japan, all over the world, saying that they had been Googling how to kill themselves, and then they had come upon this essay and they'd changed their minds. And this had, as you would imagine, an enormously powerful effect on me as a writer, or even as a philosophy professor. You don't really expect ever that your work will save someone's life. So then I thought maybe I'd only told a little tiny snapshot of my story in that essay. And I thought maybe I should tell the whole story and also try to think more deeply about my own experience and what it was that drove me to make the multiple attempts that I have, and whether there was some sort of techniques one might find that could help one to stay alive.
Several books have been written before about it throughout history, but perhaps there are not so many, considering that suicide is in many countries, such as here in Spain, for example, the main cause of death from external causes, ahead of all others, such as traffic accidents, drawings, homicides, etc. And the total number of deaths by suicide has grown by more than 5% each year in recent years, according to the National Institute of Statistics. Despite of that, talking, learning, reading, or sharing information about suicide remains something of a taboo in our society, both at a personal level and at an institutional level. So what do you think this is due to, and where does this path of silence lead us?
Such a wonderful and urgent but complex question. The World Health Organization tells us that about 10% of the world population suffers from suicidal ideation or chronic suicidal ideation. And not just in Spain, but worldwide, suicide is almost always among the top 10 leading causes of death, almost every year. Sometimes goes as high as the top 5. And so we have something like an epidemic. Now, the other thing the World Health Organization tells us is that the number one obstacle to overcoming this epidemic is stigma, taboo, social perception of the shame of suicide. And why is it the number one obstacle? Well, first of all, because this taboo is so widespread, but also because the best medicine we know of for dealing with suicidal ideation, for helping someone who's thinking of making an attempt, or for helping to prevent repeat attempts, subsequent attempts after someone has made an attempt, and thus death by suicide, is just talking about it. So what we have to do is we have to overcome the stigma. We have to overcome the taboo so that people feel free to talk about this, because this is how we're going to solve this health crisis. There is no better way to solve it. And it's a source of great frustration to me, because imagine if you could solve the coronavirus, cure the coronavirus simply by talking about it, or cure cancer simply by talking about it. This is how easy it is for us, but we are afraid to talk about it. We are ashamed of talking about it. This is part of your question. Why is that the case? And we have to get past that and recognize that suicide and suicidal ideation is just an expression of a social behavioral problem that is no different, really, than addiction to alcohol, or even in some ways, perhaps an addiction to your phone, or an addiction to sex, or an addiction to buying things. These are all different forms that of attempts of annihilating the self that we engage in. And they are all treatable, and they are none of them morally blameworthy. They are just questions of health. They're no more morally blameworthy than getting a cold.
Yeah, and at the end, this silence makes the most of us very illiterate about the mechanisms of the societal mind. We know very well how to identify and prevent dangerous behavior when driving a car, for example. But well, because our society has got the work of awareness raising done about it. But when it comes to identify or manage a dangerous self-destructive behavior, it is different. We have few sources, even though it is something much deadlier.
Right. Even though it's something much deadlier, we are afraid to talk about it. We're afraid of planting a seed that we might so for example, recently I was speaking with an editor friend of mine, and he said that he and his partner were watching the movie Beetlejuice with their 6-year-old daughter, and suddenly they remembered that the little heroine of this movie was suicidal. She was wanting to get to where the ghosts live, and they didn't know what to do. They were in a panic. They were like, "Should we turn off the movie?" And I said, "So what did you do?" And he said, "Well, we watched the movie, but we were kind of in fear the whole time, and we didn't know what to say afterward." And I said, "Well, you missed a really good opportunity, because and you still have that opportunity to talk about this with her, because we now know that children as young, and I've met people who are as young as 3 years old, 3 years old when they made their first suicide attempt. I made my own first attempt when I was 6 years old, and that's not nearly as uncommon as you think. And unfortunately, suicide rates right now are skyrocketing in this age group between 12 and 22, 23, 24. And the best medicine, again, we can have for this is being willing to talk about this, letting people know, letting even a child know that you are a safe person to talk to about these feelings.
In your opinion, has someone, as someone who has been okay in some moments with the idea of killing yourself, what do you think the suicidal mind tends to see as a sad mistake, other people's suicides, but perfectly justify his own with the cheapest arguments?
Yeah, no, this is one of the most important questions when thinking about the suicidal mind. I remember one of my visits to the psychiatric hospital. I talk about this in the book. There was this young woman there. At this time, I was in my 40s. There was a young woman there who was not yet 20 years old. She was still a teenager. And she had already made multiple attempts, I think more than 10 attempts. And I kept my distance from her because I was an older man. She was a younger woman. I didn't want to make her feel weird in any way. But she wanted to be friends with me, and she persisted, and we became friends. And we eventually got around to talking about suicide and her attempts. And it was very illuminating for me, because I could see, how enormous her heart was, what a wonderful human being she was, how much life stood in front of her and how good life could be for her and how important it was that she stay alive. But she was completely incapable of seeing this about herself. And for that very reason, this helped me to see a little bit, at least, that maybe I am suffering from the same deep confusion that she is suffering from. Maybe I too actually am not as loathsome to others as I feel to myself, you know. Maybe other people are looking at me and thinking that guy has every reason to live, the same way I was looking at her and thinking she has every reason to live. And one thing that I have found, especially since this book has come out, the more people that you can talk to, if you yourself suffer from suicidal ideation, or if you have made an attempt, or if you have lost someone to suicide, which makes you unfortunately vulnerable, much more vulnerable to suicidal ideation, the more people you can talk to who also suffer or from this, or who have made an attempt, the strangely, the more liberated you will become from this kind of thinking. So much so that in the past 6 months, maybe year now, since this book has come out in the States, it first came out about a year ago, I am amazed to report that I sometimes now will go weeks at a time without thinking of taking my own life, which that had never happened in 56 years. This never happened to me before. Every single day I wanted to kill myself my entire life until about 9 months or so ago. It's this completely bizarre change. And I think it's just because I've been talking to so many people who are like me, who suffer from suicidal ideation.
You mentioned in your book that the main pillar in the suicidal mind is probably the self-destructive feeling. There could be obviously many triggers for each person to develop a self-destructive tendency, which have a super wide range of behaviors and grades, from small symbolic gestures such as, I don't know, picking off scabs from wounds, to addictions or parasuicidal behavior. So it's just a scale in which factual death is one of the extremes. So in your experience, have you come to understand some of the sources that could lead a person to develop this kind of tendency?
Yes, it's a very helpful thing to think about. On my view, and this is a view that is argued by Sigmund Freud, but Sigmund Freud is getting it from Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer is getting it from the Buddha. On my view, the sources of our suffering are really threefold. We have an a natural aversion to pain. We have and yet pain is always coming. We have a longing for pleasure, and yet that longing is constantly frustrated. And we have a tendency towards self-annihilation. We want to escape ourselves.
There was something that you mentioned in the book that seemed to me like a founding episode. Also, it is the kind of experience that many of us could have easily faced in our childhood, when the people in charge of a child, for example, turn his or her world into a suffering place, and the child is not able, because it's complicated for a child to do it, is not able to confront them directly, so releases his anger indirectly through himself, like some kind of episode that would somehow crystallize or fix this way of escaping, because not everybody has this way, this drive.
Yeah, no, this is exactly what a great psychoanalyst named Carl Menninger thought about suicide. and the suicidal impulse, the suicidal mind. He thought, generally speaking, this began in childhood, and it began as a combination of the two things you just identified: an inability to escape circumstances which are unbearable, or miserable at least, if not unbearable, very unhappy, combined with a frustration of anger that otherwise could not be expressed. So the anger cannot be expressed outwardly because the child's circumstances will just become even more unpleasant for the poor child, even if only psychologically so, not necessarily physically so, but they will feel that much more the burden of being themselves, and they turn that anger inward. So you have these two powerful forces working together at the same time: the need to escape and violence turned against oneself. And then the solution is sort of obvious, isn't it? You know, if you're wanting to turn violence against yourself and you're wanting to escape your circumstances, it doesn't take you very, very long to get to the idea that you just should murder yourself, which is, of course, what suicide is. As John Mulaney famously says, "When I'm alone, I realize I'm with the guy who tried to kill me."
And just to finish, you mentioned before that if there is such a thing as a cure for suicide, it is talking about it. And it sounds like too simple to be true, but at the same time, it is a proven fact. So, in your opinion, what changes should be done not only as individuals, but as a society to address this matter properly?
Yeah. Well, the single most important thing we can do right now, I think, where we are right now, is to do basically exactly what you are doing, which is be willing to take the time, the effort, and the space, the energy to have an informed conversation about suicide. When people who are respected, who other people look up to, when public figures, when people who are admired are willing to have these kinds of rich conversations about suicide and to tell the truth about suicide, what happens is, it's a thing very well documented. It's called the Papageno effect, from Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute. And the character Papageno wants to take his own life, but then his friends talk to him and he changes his mind. What happens when people like you have these conversations, anyone who hears our conversation, their likelihood of suffering from suicidal ideation goes down. Their frequency of their suicidal ideation decreases. We don't know exactly why it works, but we know that it works. It statistically works. So that's the first thing I think we need to do, is to have, in the media, because of an opposite effect called the Werther effect from Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. In the media, we've been afraid to talk about suicide because we know that if you talk about it in a sensationalizing way, the suicide rate will actually go up. And so out of a kind of confused abundance of caution, the media has sort of tried to avoid the subject entirely, and we just won't talk about suicide. But unfortunately, all that does is reinforce the silence around the topic. And I've been grateful to notice that in places like the New York Times, or places like you, people are now increasingly willing to have these conversations. And if we have these conversations, we will slowly but surely dispel the stigma, and people will feel more and more open to speak to each other. As recently as the 70s, which sound very recent to me because I was born in the late 60s, there was a taboo against talking about cancer. If you had a cancer diagnosis, you were afraid to talk about it. And of course, Susan Sontag wrote about this so brilliantly. There was a moral stigma against people having cancer. And now we see how absurd that was. When I teach this subject in class, sometimes to a classroom of 400 students, I say, okay, we're going to talk about suicide. And then I tell them a little bit about my experience. And then I say, how many people in this class have had suicidal thoughts or been touched in suicide in some way and would like to talk about it? And first, like, one hand goes up, and then two hands go up. And then it's like, a wave, and about 90% of the hands in the classroom go up, and they're looking at each other with such like relief and eagerness to speak. And then it becomes, very difficult to manage the conversation, actually, because everyone wants to talk. And so that's the first major thing and crucial thing that we can do. And then the next step after that will be trying to help mental health professionals understand that therapy is probably the single best way of helping people with this, who struggle with suicidal ideation. Because the problem is, in the mental health professions right now, as soon as someone mentions that they are thinking of self-harm, a whole series of protocols go into place that still have this vaguely punitive quality to them and are mostly concerned with certain kinds of physical restraint that are justified by, preventing this person from harming themselves, but really aren't in the service of that person's psychological well-being. And the reason that the time you are most likely to die by suicide is in the first 30 days after you've been released from a psychiatric hospital following an attempt, is that those 72 or 96 hours, or the time you spend in there, you're really not dealing with the suicidal impulse and the suicidal mindset in a truly therapeutic and helpful way. And so that's the next place to go, is to the mental health professions and getting them to sort of rethink the way they've dealt with this.
Absolutely. Well, Clancy, we will always be glad to have your book in our bookstore. Thanks for writing it. And thanks for having this conversation today.
I'm so grateful to you for this conversation. And, as I say, by us having this conversation, there are people who would have attempted suicide who now won't. And there are people who would have died by those suicide attempts who now will not die. And so I am so grateful to you, and thank you very much for inviting me on to speak with you, and thank you so much for having my book in your store. It it really means a lot to me.